Well, in the last hour, Ken had a chance to show you how important it is to really take a look at beginnings, at origins, to understand purpose and destiny. And so in this hour, it's my chance to take you back to the beginning. All the way back to the beginning, as far back as you can possibly go, all the way back to the very beginning of time itself. Well, in the beginning was hydrogen. And at first that hydrogen was pressed together in some kind of ball of matter. Then for reasons we may never fully explain, that ball of matter exploded in a big bang that sent dust and gas and radiation into the ever-expanding reaches of our universe. Then under the influence of gravity, particles began to come together to form galaxies. Within those galaxies, stars began to shine. Around those stars, cold material collected together to form planets. Of all the millions and billions of planets that must have been formed in a manner like this, one is this teeny chunk of rock we call home, the Earth. Well, at first the Earth was quite different than it is now. Lightning flashed back and forth in an atmosphere of methane and ammonia for perhaps 2 billion years, until finally, just by chance, a group of molecules got together that could reproduce, and life on Earth began. About 600 million years ago, we pick up the first simple beginnings of life, like those little trilobites. About 400 million years ago, the first land plants and animals appear in the sequence. About 4 million years ago, those first apes take those upright steps toward becoming human beings. Well, human beings are the first animals who are able to look back over the history of how they developed. As we do so, we learn things that are helpful in understanding ourselves and our nature. Why is it that we do things that are harmful and hurtful to our own kind? Wars, crime, things like that. It's that jungle fight for survival that brought us into being in the first place. But we're not without hope. We're already beginning to take control of that molecule of heredity, DNA. We can begin to reshape ourselves into our own image of what man really ought to be. Man is already reaching for the stars. There's simply no limit to what man can do. Hands up all those who think that's a good summary of the opening chapters of Genesis as explained by Ken Ham. Okay. Say, ushers, would you please? No. Well, I think you recognize that what I just told you is the exact opposite, isn't it, of everything you read in the book of Genesis and the rest of the Bible as well. But it is a story you've heard before, isn't it? What do we call the story that I just told you? Evolution. And so evolution, unfortunately, is a story that I used to tell. The first several years that I taught college biology, I taught it as an evolutionist. And it wasn't just a minor thing for me. I really tried to convince people that evolution was true and that they would have to change their ideas about God to fit with the so-called facts of evolution. And just for the young people, I'd kind of like to emphasize that story I just told you, I now recognize is the biggest lie that I ever told. But for many years, I didn't think of it as a lie. I thought of it as an alternate religion, of another way of looking at things that was really rooted in science. And I felt as a scientist I had a part in this new age, this new wave of things to come. Christians were always talking about back to God, back to the Bible. But here I was talking about remaking ourselves in our own image of what we ought to be. Of really bringing heaven on earth, not this pie in the sky, by and by. Well, you might think, if that's the way I believed, what is it that changed me from that belief in evolution to creation? It wasn't just a minor thing, as Harlow Shapley said here. Some people piously record, in the beginning God, but I say, in the beginning hydrogen. And he went on to say, give me hydrogen and I can give you the universe. And we can be done once and for all with myths and fables about a God or gods who created things. As Ken's explained so eloquently with quotes from evolutionists understand the spiritual warfare that exists between evolution and the Bible. Christians often pass it off as a minor thing. As an evolutionist, I understood that battle. And I was willing to battle for evolution and to try to convince people they had to give up their old-fashioned ideas about God. Well, for me, change came in a most unexpected manner. It began with my first college teaching job. Now, that wasn't at Clearwater Christian College. As a matter of fact, at this first Christian college where I taught, I told them I was an evolutionist, that I didn't believe in God, but that didn't make any particular difference here. I had all the right background and academic awards and credentials and so on, so they hired me to teach there. Well, the chemistry prof noticed that my wife and I didn't do a lot of Christian things like going to church and so on, so he invited us to his home for Bible study. Well, now at the time I thought it was crazy that people in the 20th century would still study a dusty old outmoded book like the Bible, but free coffee and donuts. Now, those are three of my favorite words. So for all the wrong reasons, we took off for this Bible study on Tuesday nights. And just to keep the discussion honest, I resolved to point out all the errors and mistakes there were in the Bible. Well, there were lots of errors and mistakes, all right, but they were all mine. This guy was a pretty good Bible teacher, but free coffee and donuts, we kept going back anyway. About that time, I got a copy in the mail of the first books that I ever wrote. One was on DNA, that molecule of heredity. And as I looked at that book and my name on the cover and so on, it had a life-changing impact on me. Up until that time, I thought that people who wrote books, especially science textbooks, knew what they were talking about. But I'd written that book, and I knew all of the mysteries and uncertainties that went into it. In those days, we weren't sure of whether the DNA code read the same left to right as it did right to left and all that sort of thing. Even though it had been reviewed by experts in the field, there were all of these uncertainties. In fact, 5 years later, I wrote the second edition of that DNA book, thumbed through the first edition, and just laid it aside. So much had changed in just 5 years. Maybe you've had someone say this to you: you can't take the Bible as a textbook of science. I like to say you're right about that. I've written 5 textbooks of science. They've all had to be rewritten. The Bible never had to be rewritten once. God got it right the first time. And so I began to pay attention to that Bible study, and suddenly it didn't seem so strange that perhaps God wrote a book in which he said what he meant and meant what he said. And I faced that choice that Ken Ham has laid out to you before. Who will we believe? The words of experts who weren't there, who don't know everything, experts like me? Or would we believe the Word of God who was there, who does know everything, who doesn't make mistakes, and who cares about me a great deal? And so the Lord convinced me through His Spirit He really was speaking in His Word, and I became a Christian. You know the sequel to that story. As soon as I became a Christian, my wife and I got along ever so much better. Our 4 little children began to behave like perfect little angels. Well, not quite. Actually, that time of first belief really is special. There was a while where it seemed like my feet could hardly touch the ground. It was so exciting to be in tune with the Lord God, maker of heaven and earth. But a lot of times, the Lord lets us go through a period of second thoughts, of doubt, so we can measure for ourselves what our new faith really means. For me, those doubts came in the form of what to do with all the so-called mountains of evidence for evolution. Aha! The light bulb goes on. All that stuff about evolution is true, but God did it. Now, at the time, I thought that was an original idea. You can tell how young I was. I found out since it's a very common idea, sometimes called theistic evolution, sometimes called progressive creation. And it seemed to fit perfectly. I could go to church on Sunday and believe everything in the Bible. I could go back to class on Monday and still teach my students all the old examples of evolution I'd been forced to learn. It seemed like the easy way out. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized those two are really opposites of one another. I think a lot of people, we all admit there are a lot of people who somehow try to put the Bible and evolution together, and I think they, like me, have a false, romanticized idea about what evolution is all about. You may think of evolution as step-by-step, upward, onward progress. Well, that sounds like something God might do. But the evolutionary process, as the evolutionists envision it, is something quite different from what a lot of people imagine. Here's the way Darwin put it in the summary paragraphs of his Origin of Species. Thus, from the war of nature, famine and death, the war of nature, famine and death, the production of higher animals directly follows. Even the evolution of cooperation can only proceed over the dead bodies of those who don't cooperate. And natural selection is a struggle for survival among the offspring, brothers and sisters, the offspring of the same litter. Only some of those genes can survive to the next generation, or there is no evolution at all, except for a constant death, 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 death. And I began to think, does that sound like a way God would create the world all very good? This is the God who in Genesis 6 tells us he was grieved to his heart at the violence and corruption that filled the earth after man's fall or plunge into sin. Well, if God was grieved to his heart at violence and death and struggle and corruption, why would he use violence, death, struggle, and corruption as his means of creation? It didn't seem to fit. Why would Christ come to conquer death if death was God's way of making evolution happen? It would mean that Christ's coming wouldn't have any meaning at all. And it's not just a matter of a few verses. The idea of evolution is the total opposite of the whole gospel message. And I began to worry about that. By the way, this is what evolutionists still believe. Every once in a while, Carl Sagan makes the cover of Time magazine or Parade magazine or something like that. Always interesting, not always correct, but always interesting. And he put it this way: how did we as human beings get here? Only through an immense number of deaths. Death and accident, death and accident, death and accident over millions of years are you and I, brains and all, here today. And I saw that, it just didn't add up. Jacques Monod, famous atheist, once put it this way: he was surprised that any Christian would believe that God would use such a cruel, wasteful, and inefficient process as evolution for his means of creation. Well, as clear and simple as that is, I'm not sure I could have gotten myself out of that theistic evolution trap on my own. The good news is what? God doesn't expect us to do it all on our own. He sent some help. Well, help came to me in the form of the new biologist hired at the college. Now, this time the Christian college made a mistake and hired a fellow who was already a Christian, already a creationist. And he showed up at my home with a very famous or infamous book, depending on your point of view, The Genesis Flood by Drs. Whitcomb and Morris. And Alan Davis wanted to read through this book with me, and show me some of the problems in evolution, the evidence of creation. We read a few paragraphs together. I got all upset and angry and irate. Don't these people know anything? Don't they know this? Don't they know that? And I threw all my evolutionary arguments at me, And Alan got me calmed down. We tried another few paragraphs. Same thing, just mad and throwing evolution questions and comments at them. Little did I know the Lord was beginning to prepare me for this ministry. Well, after finally Alan said, well, maybe you ought to read that book on your own, and we'll talk about it when you're done with it. And so I read the rest of that book. Of course, later on, I worked for Dr. Morris. I never had the courage to show him the nasty notes I wrote on the early pages of his book. But by the time I'd finished, I'd begun to feel cheated. Why had no one ever pointed out to me the problems in evolution, the evidence of creation? Well, there's a funny phrase, isn't it? Evidence of creation. Even many Christians think, well, evidence, that's something else. Creation's something you believe or you don't believe. It's a matter of faith. We really don't talk about evidence of creation. Well, may I suggest to you that nothing is really easier and more natural than scientists and just ordinary people in finding and recognizing evidence of creation. Many of you have had an experience like this, walking along a little creek bed or so on, and finding a pebble or something like that, some little stone that may have some appearance of design. I remember my daughter finding a little stone that looked like a little Dutch wooden shoe in miniature. But as I rolled it around in my hand, I could see that the lines of wear in the rock followed lines of weakness in the rock. The softer minerals were worn away faster than the harder minerals. In spite of some appearance of design, that tumbled pebble was just the result of time, chance, and continuing natural processes. Well, as an evolutionist, that's what I was teaching my students, that you're like that tumbled pebble. You're a result simply of time, chance, and the natural processes like mutation and the struggle for survival. But many of you, especially in this area, have had the experience of finding an arrowhead along a creek bed or in a plowed field or something like that. And there you see the chip marks go with and against the grain of the rock. The softer mineral, harder minerals are cut through equally. When you look at something as simple as an arrowhead, no working parts, still you recognize evidence of creation, matter shaped and molded by a plan that gives it a special purpose. What do you need to recognize evidence of creation? Answer: the ordinary tools of science, logic and observation. That's all you need, the ordinary tools of science, logic and observation. They're simply patterns of order in our universe that tell us they're not a result of time, chance, and chemistry, but plan, purpose, and special acts of creation.